Well, okay. Happy to begin, and to begin with just a warm welcome. I'm Michael Murphy. It's my privilege to direct the Hank Center here at Loyola Chicago, and I'm really happy that you've made time for this important conversation, reckoning with history, Jesuit slaveholding, and the present work of restorative justice. Before I begin, I'm really glad we have the shades up. There's a little bit of a glare, but did you catch that moon tonight? Yeah. It came up kind of, I don't know if it's a harvest moon, but it came up in that orange way, and I was just arresting. So what another beautiful day, and grateful for our lives together that we're able to live such a beautiful, but sometimes very challenging life. The Hank Center has been working on amplifying the history of the hard history of Jesuit slaveholding, of enslaving people for just about 10 years. Too few years. A history that I think was hiding in plain sight, but that people didn't engage until, people always knew about it, I think, that didn't want to talk about it. But then it happened in about 2004 where it got more formalized, and we'll hear more about that tonight as we continue on our journey. For our part, it was our graduate assistant at the time, now Dr. Kelly Schmidt, who educated us about 10 years ago on these facts. And Kelly has only risen to be, her scholarship's very important, and we thank her. We did an event in 2017 called Through the Lens of Data, the Enslaved Population Owned and Sold by the Maryland Province Jesuits, and worked closely with Kelly Schmidt, Dr. Kyle Roberts, and Dr. Sharon Leone from the Jesuit Plantation Project, which is still a title I confess I'm uneasy with. It just sounds different. The work continues. We have had reading groups and summer sessions. We have made bibliographies, and we've hopefully inspired some action in a small way from the Hank Center. Again, far too little work. I want to thank for tonight our staff, Office Manager Katie Arnold, Grad Assistant Julian Sieber. Yeah, way to go, Katie. Julian Sieber has done great work. Our intrepid interns, undergrad interns, Mary Countryman and Vincent DeStasio. More about our gratitude to Katie in a minute, as she'll be introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Rachel L. Swarns, and I'm glad to see you again, Rachel. But I wanted to introduce our conversation partners now, and you'll see what I mean after Katie goes and introduces Rachel. But I want to welcome especially Monique Maddox and Father Tim Kesicki, and just read a couple things about them. And I want to remind you that Rachel has graciously agreed to sign books. If you have books, she's going to hang around and sign books. I had ordered books from Amazon. First, I'm sorry, I'm going to vent here. University bookstores don't sell books anymore. And so we used to do that in partners. So I had to order from Amazon, and the delivery's late. But I wanted to give out about 30 books tonight. We couldn't do it. So somebody will get them, because this 272 is a book you're going to want to read. It's moving, the prose is majestic, the story is compelling, and you get to open your eyes because you identify with a family. And so, highly recommended. We're so happy to have Monique Trusclair Maddox in our midst. Monique, what a delight to work with you. She's the CEO of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, as well as the chair of the board of directors. She is a 5th and 6th generation granddaughter of Isaac Hawkins and 4th generation granddaughter of Nace Butler. She is a native of, I hope I don't mess this up, Monique, Maringouin? Oh, I think it's a 6 out of 10. Louisiana, and lives in Edina, Minnesota. Welcome, Monique. Father Tim Kesicki is the president used to be the president of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the U.S. When he was conference president, Father Kesicki worked with the Jesuit provincials of the U.S. and Canada, implementing programs and representing the conference internationally, and served as the religious superior of the Boston School of Theology and Ministry and the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara in University California, Berkeley. My God, I went there and I can't even pronounce the name. But now, more importantly, I think that was the work that Tim has done, and we're forever indebted to your work. But Tim's back working with men in formation and working with younger Jesuits who are in formation at St. Louis University. So welcome, Tim. Thank you very much. Now, it's my honor to invite Katie Arnold to the podium. Katie has been the chief architect of this event. And I want to thank you, Katie, for your superb work and dedication of getting this together. It's such a great looking program and so substantive and so edifying. And I just want to say thank you. And so Katie's going to say a couple words, and she's going to introduce Rachel, then we're going to be able to dig into our conversation. So Katie, welcome.
Ooh, hello, everyone. It is absolutely wonderful to see you all here. This event is very near and dear to my heart, and it is the product of passion, supportive teammates, and synchronicity. Before coming to Loyola, I had a career in the field of public history. I worked in the development of museum exhibitions and programs, in documentary filmmaking, and for a time, even in costume interpretation. Yes, at one point, my work uniform included a hoop skirt and a corset. My job was to engage directly with history and to find ways to share it that would help our audiences connect to it. When it came to difficult topics like American slavery, my job became much more challenging. Sharing these stories would, at worst, elicit exclamations of denial about these facts. And at best, it would cause great discomfort as people grappled with the reality of this part of our story. These reactions had a great impact on me, and I found myself reflecting continuously. I became passionate about the idea of interpreting difficult history, and I pondered questions like, how do we approach these truths that make us feel uncomfortable? What happens when we engage with the history that is ugly, sinful, and tragic? What do we do when these facts challenge aspects of our identity? And is reconciliation possible? Last year, actually almost exactly 1 year ago, while planning a trip to historic sites in southern Louisiana, known for doing the work of interpreting difficult history, Dr. Murphy gave me a challenge of connecting these ideas to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and by extension, my personal faith as a Catholic. I had never explicitly been asked to think about these questions in the context of my personal faith, but I found the idea intriguing. That is when I found articles about Georgetown in the New York Times and the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project hosted by the Jesuits. Literally a month after my trip, I met Monique and Father Kesicki at a conference that I attended with the Hank Center team, and the idea for this event was born. I was greatly moved by the honesty and the grace with which Ms. Maddox spoke. Knowing that the Hank Center was invested in the work of restorative justice, and still is, we took the idea of a large event to Dr. Murphy, and away we went. Call it synchronicity, or call it the work of the Spirit, the panelists that you will meet tonight, and hopefully tomorrow, they're not here by accident. And it's been an absolute privilege to work with each of our panelists, especially Monique and Father Kesicki, and Rachel. The work that our panelists have done serves as an inspiration to me, and this experience has helped me to grow personally, professionally, and spiritually. And I'm so grateful that you all are here to hear their stories. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rachel Swarns. Rachel is the author of The 272, the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. She is a contributing writer to the New York Times, where she previously spent 22 years as a full-time correspondent and served as their Johannesburg bureau chief. She is an associate professor at New York University and has been elected to the Society of American Historians. Please welcome Rachel Swarns.
little shorter than she is. I'm gonna like move this around a little bit if I can. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here. I want to walk you through how I got started on this journey, how I began reckoning with this history of Jesuit slaveholding, what I've learned, and what all of this history means to all of us as Catholics, as Americans, here and now. And then I'll have some photos that I want to share with you because I'm a journalist, so I have to have some visuals. But I'd also really like to hear your questions and your thoughts, because this is history that we have to grapple with, engage with together as a community. All of us here in this space, and all of us really in this country. And whenever I talk about this history, I usually like to start by telling a story to set the stage for the conversation that we're going to have. And to do that, I need to take you away just for a minute from this lovely space that we're in. And I need to take you back in time. I want to take you back to November of 1838, back to the docks in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from where the nation's capital is now. And if you had been standing on the wharf there that day, you would have seen them. Scores of people being loaded onto a ship, forcibly loaded. There were husbands and wives, children, babies. You would have seen the crush of the crowd, parents clinging to their children, babies wailing. Eyewitnesses described people falling to their knees, begging for mercy. These were enslaved African Americans who had been sold and were being shipped to the Deep South, to Louisiana, far from the world that they knew and the people that they loved. And they had been enslaved and sold by some of the nation's most powerful Catholic priests, Jesuit priests, who happened to be among the largest slaveholders in Maryland. And when times got tough, these priests did what a lot of people did, which was to sell off their assets. In this case, we're talking about human property. 272 men, women, and children to save the prize mission project of the Jesuits at the time, the college we now know as Georgetown University, the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning. And it worked. The priests were successful. The sale went through. The cash rolled in. Georgetown, as we all know, survived. It is one of our nation's elite universities. But all of this came at a terrible, terrible cost. Scores of families were torn apart, and they were almost completely forgotten for nearly a century. And I stumbled across this bit of history, and I feel bad. I gotta re-angle myself for this side of the room. I'm just gonna lower this here. I stumbled across this bit of history back in 2016. And the story started, as many big stories do, with a tip. A colleague of mine in the business section of the Times, BizDay, got an email from a Georgetown alum who happened to be a CEO of a tech company, and he was pitching the New York Times on an exclusive about a 19th century slave sale that organized by Catholic priests that benefited Georgetown. And my colleague was intrigued, but uncertain, because a 19th century slave sale, was that even a news story for the Times? And you have to remember, this was 2016. The 1619 project hadn't been conceived or written yet. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his powerful case for reparations, which appeared in The Atlantic. But newspapers then, as now, wrote mostly about the here and now. And so I am always very grateful that she didn't just delete the email. And she didn't delete the email because she remembered that there was someone at the Times who she thought might know whether this was a story. My first book, American Tapestry, was about Michelle Obama and her enslaved ancestors. And it traced their journey from slavery, her family's journey from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. And she knew I had spent time digging around in the archives. And so she sent that email to me. And I knew immediately that it was a story. My work on Michelle Obama's ancestors had allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I could see immediately, like, this was the next step in the kind of work that I'd like to do, which was to examine how slavery shaped American institutions. So I knew it was a story, but I was also flabbergasted. Catholic priests enslaved people. Catholic priests bought and sold people. Historians and Jesuits knew this history, but most ordinary people, myself included, Black and Catholic, had never heard anything of this. And I wanted to know more about these priests, and I wanted to know more about these families. And so I got on the phone with this guy who had sent us this email. His name was Richard Cellini, to find out what he knew. And Richard had gotten interested in this because of events that had taken place at Georgetown just a few months earlier. Students on campus had staged a protest on campus. They were concerned about 2 buildings that carry the names of 2 of the priests, early presidents of Georgetown, who had been involved with orchestrating this sale. Now, Georgetown had already established a working group to wrestle with this history and had been thinking about removing the names. And so, in fact, they did remove the names. And that might have been that. Except Richard, up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, looking at all of this, thought to himself, okay, interesting situation. We have a protest. We have names changed, buildings, et cetera. Okay, all good, but what about the people? And so he decided to reach out to a member of the working group. What about the 272? What happened to them? What happened to their descendants? And the professor that he reached out to, who was a member of this working group working on this history, told him they all died. Richard had that reaction. He said, they all died? And the professor said, yeah, they all died. You know, Louisiana, malaria, you know, lots of stuff like that. And Richard said, nearly 300 people, and they all died? They all died. Now, Richard thought that was ludicrous, and he was kind of outraged, actually. And he's an interesting guy. He's a white guy, you know, corporate CEO, who until then had never really been, you know, engaged in social justice issues or racial justice issues. But as I mentioned, he was a Georgetown alum, and he loved Georgetown. And he kind of felt like Georgetown owed its existence to these people. And so he felt like he had to do something. And what he decided to do was to hire a team of genealogists. And he asked them to answer the question that he had asked that professor, which was, what happened to these people? And who were their descendants, if there were any? And by the time he reached out to me, his team had identified a handful of descendants. No, they didn't all die. So I felt like this story was urgent. I may have been the only one at the New York Times that felt like this story was urgent, but I felt like it was urgent. It illuminated for me how foundational slavery was to our country and to our institutions. But would it resonate with our readers? You know, I figured we'd just have to find out. So the first story, which you see up on the screen over there, appeared in April of 2016 under the headline, 272 Slaves Were Sold to Save Georgetown University. What does it owe their descendants? And we also ran a companion piece with that story. As I mentioned, Richard's group, and he actually ended up establishing an independent nonprofit called the Georgetown Memory Project, had identified a handful of descendants, but we knew there must be more. And so in this companion piece, we posted a link to the passenger list, the passenger manifest of that ship that I described that left from the dock in Alexandria, Virginia. And that was an important document because it carried the names of the people on board, first and last names. And if you are familiar with the records of this time, you know that enslaved people are often nameless in the records or only appear by first names. But this list had first and last names. So we published that and we asked readers, are you connected to this history? Do you recognize family names on this list? Are you Black and Catholic and from Southern Maryland, where the Jesuit plantations were located? Are you Black and Catholic and from Maringouin, where many of these people ended up? More than 1 million people read that story that you see up there, and thousands shared it on social media. It was one of the most widely read stories in the New York Times that year. And scores of people contacted us because they recognized their families in that list, in that document. Descendants of those 272 people learned about their ties to this wrenching history, and they started to organize. But more about that in a bit. As this was going on and I was writing more and more about the 272 in Georgetown, I started to realize that this was about more than just Georgetown. It was about the Catholic Church itself. So I decided to write a book. I thought it would take 2 years. It took 7. Journalists and deadlines, you know, sometimes takes a little longer. There was a pandemic, so you got to give me a little room there. And I really wanted to grapple with some of those questions that I had from the very beginning, which were, you know, why didn't we know this history and what more was there to know? And I grew up in New York City, and where I'm from, the Catholic Church that I know and that many people know is a Northern church, an immigrant church. And that makes sense because enslaved people have been largely left out of the origin story that is traditionally told about the Catholic Church. But here is what I learned. Slavery was, in fact, foundational to the emergence of the Catholic Church in the British colonies and in the early United States. Priests who relied on slave labor and slave sales established the nation's first Catholic archdiocese, the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown, helped build the nation's first Catholic cathedral, helped to establish some of the early convents. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the nation's first Catholic seminary. The very underpinnings of the Catholic Church were built by priests who relied on slavery. But in writing this book, I was confronted with a challenge. How do you tell this story? And how do you get people to listen, to hear it? Because when you are researching or writing about slavery, you're keenly aware that there are many people who from the get-go are going to say, no thank you, not interested, long time ago, nothing to do with me. And I'm a journalist, so I think about audience and about engaging audience. And it seemed clear to me that the way to draw people in and the way to deal with the erasure of the enslaved at the heart of the story of Catholicism in the United States was to focus on the families. 272 people were sold, scores of families. I would tell the story of one. And so I tell the story of the Mahonies, and their experience parallels the emergence of the Catholic Church in the British colonies and the church's beginning reliance on slavery and slave labor. And the story starts with the matriarch of the family, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland in the late 1600s. Maryland, as some of you will know, a colony established in part as a refuge for Catholics who experienced discrimination in England. So Anne Joyce arrives on a ship in Maryland, a black woman, and she arrives, as many newcomers did at that time, as an indentured servant. So we all know a bit about indentured servants, right? You know, people, mostly Europeans, who came, they had a contract, a term of years to work, and then they were going to go on their way. And that was certainly Anne Joyce's dream, too. But she arrived at a time when Maryland was transitioning from a colony that relied on indentured servants for its labor force to one that relied on enslaved labor. Her contract was burned, she was forced into slavery, and she lost everything. Everything except her story. And she told that story to anyone who would listen. The white people around her, her children and her grandchildren, and their descendants told that story. And her descendants resist. So she has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She had descendants who took the Jesuits to court, filed lawsuits against the Jesuits to try and win their freedom, but only a handful managed that way. One of her descendants, Harry Mahoney, during the War of 1812, saved the church's wealth on the plantation where he was enslaved, and because of that, garnered a promise, a pledge from the Jesuits, who, for his courage and loyalty, promised that neither he nor his family would ever be sold. And that was a promise that was broken in that sale that I talked about in 1838, when most of his children were sold. So, what are we talking about in terms of conditions and treatment? In the archives, I found records that documented the whipping of pregnant women, children sold without their parents, a girl swapped for a horse. I read letters written by priests in the 1820s who acknowledged that families were being housed in dilapidated quarters that were, quote, almost universally unfit for human beings, close quotes. Archbishop Carroll, the nation's first archbishop, epitomized the callousness when he described what should be done to address some of the debts on some of the plantations. Sell, quote, 2 unnecessary Negroes, close quote, he wrote. But it's really important to know all along the way that there were people who raised questions and concerns and even protested the sale of Black people. And this is important because when you're doing the kind of work that I'm doing, there are also those people who will say, wait a second, don't bring your 21st century moral judgments to this history. This was a long time ago, and slavery was legal. And that is true. But I'm also here to tell you that there were priests who were wrestling with these moral questions in real time. They were lonely voices for sure, but they were important voices. And I think you might be asking yourself, well, why were there few? And how in the world did people justify this kind of thing? And it's a really interesting question because these priests were actually quite complicated in a lot of ways. Unlike some white people at the time, they didn't view enslaved people, Black people, as brutes, as animals. They didn't. They viewed them as human beings with souls. And they believed that they, as priests, had an obligation to tend to and to nurture those souls at the very same time that they felt comfortable buying and selling their bodies. And you're asking yourself, as I did too, well, how did they square that circle? And, part of it was what I mentioned before. Slavery obviously was legal. But also it's true that Rome, which had condemned the enslavement of the indigenous in the Americas, remained silent for a very, very long time about the buying and selling of black bodies. So to talk again, to bring you back to that point I made about the lonely voices and the discussions within the church, I want to introduce you to two people who exemplify that divide. The first was Thomas Milady. He's an important early president of Georgetown and an influential leader of the Jesuits, who was in the 1830s. And he was a member of this first American-born generation of Jesuits who was sent off to Rome to be educated, to be leaders in the church. And Milady had grown up around slavery. His father enslaved people, so he knew it up close. And he was also something of a visionary. He looked around and he said, the future of the Catholic Church is not this rural plantation-based system that we have here. Milady looked north and he saw immigrants pouring into the cities, Catholic immigrants. And he said, the future is there. And what we need to do is to position ourselves to establish a constellation of colleges up and down the mid-Atlantic seaboard to serve these newcomers. And of course, we know that Milady was 100% right. That was where the future was. But the way to get there, the way to get the money to get there, he decided was to sell off these people, 272 men, women, and children, to make that vision a reality. And now I want to tell you about a different man, another priest, who had epitomized a very, very different view. His name is Joseph Carberry, also American-born, also had relatives who were enslavers, but somehow he had a very, very different view of the people who were enslaved on the plantation that he managed. When he looked around at these people, he saw capacity and he saw faith. He wrote a letter about a man who built a windmill on the plantation and marveled at the craftsmanship. The Jesuits often grumbled about the black people on the plantations and why weren't they working harder. Joseph Carberry said, maybe if we paid them, they might work some harder, right? And so he established an experiment on his plantation that he managed, where he divided up the land and parceled it out to families, said, work it as you will, and at the end of the day, you will share in some of the profits. And when a senior Jesuit from Ireland who had visited that plantation in the 1820s came back and saw it in the 1830s, he marveled at the difference. And when Joseph Carberry heard about the plans afoot for this mass sale, he organized everyone in his community, white and black, to pray that this would not happen. And when it became clear that that would not be enough, he went to Georgetown himself to voice his opposition to the sale. And when it became clear that that would not be enough, and when the slave traders were on the borders of his plantation, he urged members of the Mahoney family to run. Again, a lonely voice for sure, but it gives you a sense of kind of the range of opinion and the debate that was going on at the time. So this is a story of heartbreak and hardship for sure. But it is also a story of resilience and family and faith. One of the most surprising things that I learned in my research was that many of these families, after being sold, after seeing their families torn apart, after being betrayed by the priests in the church that they knew, after the Civil War, when they could choose a place to worship, many of these families decided to stay. Not only did they decide to stay, but many of them became lay leaders, even religious leaders in the church, and worked to make the church more reflective of and responsive to a diverse flocks and to the ideals of the Catholic Church itself. Now, how did they come to that decision? We don't really know. And it's important to understand that many Black people left the Catholic Church. In New Orleans, thousands left because after the Civil War, the church was segregated and in all kinds of ways, in seating, in terms of who received communion first, in terms of the order of processions. People left. These people decided to stay. We haven't come up with records that document, what informed that decision. But I like to think that those people thought that the church did not belong to those sinful white men, those priests, that they thought that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit belonged to them as well. And as a Black Catholic, their determination to remain in the church and try to reshape the church really inspires me. So, where are we now? Georgetown and the Jesuits have apologized for participating in the American slave trade. Georgetown has taken a number of additional steps, renaming buildings, as I mentioned, establishing an institute for the study of slavery. You'll hear from the director of that institute tomorrow. The university also now offers preference in admissions, legacy status, in effect, to descendants of the folks who were enslaved by the Jesuits. And a number of people have attended, of descendants have attended and graduated from Georgetown. And the institution has also established what they describe as a reconciliation fund. Georgetown is raising $400,000 a year for projects that benefit the descendant community. And in fact, just this week, the second round of grants were announced. As for the Jesuits, and you'll hear more from Father Kesicki later on, but they partnered with descendant leaders to establish a foundation, and they've committed to raising $100 million to support projects that benefit descendants, for scholarships, as well as to support racial reconciliation initiatives. It represents the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to address its history of enslavement in the United States. I should add that fundraising has gone slower than many people had hoped. So last year, Georgetown and the Jesuits contributed even more, an additional $27 million, if I'm recalling correctly, right? Bringing their total to $42 million and a bit closer to that $100 million goal. And they are not alone. The two institutions are now in the forefront of what has emerged as a fledgling reparations movement in this country. And there are now more than 90 universities, including Harvard, Yale, many others, who have established a consortium, universities studying slavery, trying to grapple with their history. I mentioned Father Milady's vision of this constellation of colleges. As we know, there are a whole range of Jesuit colleges around the country, and some of them receive direct financial support from the Maryland Jesuits and are grappling with their history now. Loyola, Maryland is one of those institutions, as is Holy Cross. And many other institutions received support in other ways, with staff, for instance, leadership. And, we shouldn't think that this history is just a Maryland Jesuit history, an East Coast phenomenon. Many of you may know about Father Damon, right? Here at Loyola, who received his training in Missouri at a novitiate which was established and run with the help of slave labor. So this is part of the history here as well. And it's not just Georgetown, it's not just the Catholic Church either. And there are a number of religious organizations. The Episcopalians are wrestling with this. The Quakers enslaved people even before they didn't. And it's not just universities and religious organizations. We're talking about financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, cities and states around the country, right? Evanston, not far from here. wrestling with this history. Boston looking at the slave trade, New York, California. This reckoning is happening all around us, and I have to be honest and say that I never thought I would see anything like it. I think it is the clearest example, for me anyway, of how understanding history can sometimes help to propel change. But at the same time that we're seeing this flurry of experimentation around the country, we are also all so very aware of the pushback. So history right now is a battleground, and those of us who are doing this work are facing some serious headwinds. There are politicians, as we know, around the country who want to stop people from doing this kind of work, from writing books, or teaching about race and slavery, and this is happening at the same time. I often feel like there are two trains running. I told you that this felt urgent to me in 2016. It feels even more urgent to me now. But I remain inspired by one of the most surprising developments that has come from those first articles that I wrote for the Times. You'll remember that when I told you that Richard Cellini had hired this team of genealogists when I had written that first article, and that they had identified a handful of descendants. Well, today, there are more than 6,000 descendants who have been identified. And more than 100 years after that 1838 sale, these descendants, who now know their history, are busy at work stitching those families that were torn apart back together. Monique will tell you more about that, but they've been holding family reunions, weekly Zoom meetings, sharing photographs and stories and memories. And to me, it is one of the most touching and meaningful examples of how transformative and important this history can be. I'm going to wrap up there, but I would, of course, like to share some photos with you. And if I can get them rolling, I will do that. Hold on. Okay, so this is the story that I mentioned, obviously, that ran in April of 2016. When I mentioned that my strategy for my book was to focus on one family, I had a similar idea with that first story. Again, how do I get people to hear? I thought 272 people were sold. I tell the story of one, and if I could, I tell the story of a child, because I think it would make it harder for people to turn away. I tell the story of a child and follow that journey from the wharf in Alexandria, Virginia, to Louisiana and across time to today. And so I told the story of Cornelius, and this is his descendant, Maxine Crump, in Baton Rouge. The companion story that I wrote, where we asked people, do you have a personal connection to this story, ended up with this headline. Sandra Thomas is one of the descendants who learned of her history from the story and was an early leader of one of the descendant associations. Charles Hill in Maringouin, Louisiana, also discovered his history, and he's one of those descendants who remains very Catholic to this day. This is from the Maryland State Archives, and it depicts the period around when Anne Joyce arrived in the Chesapeake in the late 1600s. This is from Georgetown's archives, a painting of the St. Inigos plantation where many of the Mahoney family members were enslaved. This is an early image of Georgetown from the 1820s. This is Thomas Milady, the early president and Jesuit leader who was one of the key architects of the sale. And I want to say, sometimes when you're spending a lot of time with dead people, which I do, you're spending a lot of time with their writing, and he's a fascinating person because he really was a visionary, and his writing, his personality just crackles off the page from the letters he wrote. He was really quite someone. And this is William McSherry, another early president of Georgetown who, with Thomas Mulady, helped to orchestrate that sale. This is the Catherine Jackson, the ship that carried many of these people to Louisiana from the docks in Alexandria. And this is a painting that shows the plantation where many of the it's a general store, and behind the store is a plantation in Ascension Parish where a number of the Mahoney family members ended up. I mentioned that many or some members of these families remained Catholic. This is a descendant of the Mahoney families. I mentioned Harry Mahoney, who had that promise that was broken. He had two sisters who I write about, Anna and Louisa. And when Joseph Carberry, the priest, warned the Mahoney family, members of the Mahoney family, to run, Louisa, the younger sister, managed to grab her mother and to take her off and run into the woods. Her sister Anna, who had young children, didn't make it. The sisters never saw each other again. This is a descendant of Anna in Louisiana, who became involved in the movement to establish black parishes in New Orleans. This is a picture from the Maryland side, and it's a lovely picture of from the early 20th century of black Catholics in that area where they were. And this here is a picture of the man who is standing is the son of Louisa, the sister that ended up staying in Louisiana. There was some thinking that the older woman might be Louisa too, though I know there's some debate about that. And this is on the Maryland side. I mentioned there were some religious leaders. There are actually at least two people, women who joined religious orders. She was in Maryland, joining the Oblate Sisters. And there's a Mother Superior in New Orleans who established orphanages, even an overseas mission in Central America. And this sister, too, was involved in running schools. These two people, Jeremy Alexander and Melissa Kemp, are descendants of those two sisters. Melissa is a descendant of Louisa, who stayed in Maryland. Jeremy is a descendant of Anna, who ended up being taken to Louisiana. And, the story is basically that, Jeremy, who had always been interested in his family history, had done one of those DNA tests. Maybe you've done them a cheek swab, you send it off to the company and they do their magic. You get your DNA map. And then also, too, they'll connect you to folks who you're kind of DNA cousins with, right? So he and Melissa have a match. They connect via email and decide to chat. And Melissa says, I think it's the two sisters, these two sisters, Louisa and Anna, and I think that's the connection. And maybe you read this story that ran in the New York Times about this slave sale in Georgetown, from 1838. And he said, do you know where I am? He was in his office at Georgetown, where he works. And he learned that day that his employer had enslaved and sold his ancestors, and learned his history. And the two of them have also been involved in this movement among descendants to press the church in Georgetown to address this history. So with that, I will wrap it up, and thank you for your time.
We can leave Jeremy there. He's my cousin. We learned that later through DNA, of course. It's really hard to follow Rachel, I will say, after listening to the harrowing stories of children being separated from families on the wharf. Those were my family members. So that's difficult for me to follow. But I'll do my best by reading some texts that I have written. So again, my name is Monique Trusclair Maddox, and I am the president and CEO of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. I am also a descendant of Catholic slaveholding. All 4 of my grandparents descend from this history. They were all held enslaved by the Jesuit order, the largest religious Catholic order of clerics regular of pontifical right for men in the Catholic Church in the world. I first learned of my ties to this history leaving Mass, Palm Sunday, 2016. As many of us do, I disconnect from the world when I enter a space of worship. And it was my reconnection with the world that changed the trajectory of what I would do for the rest of my working years. And I know it was the divine spirit that ordered that New York Times article to show up on my cell phone, proclaiming that the oldest and one of the largest Jesuit and Catholic research institutions in America had disclosed that it exists today because the Jesuit order sold enslaved persons to save it from financial ruin. This news article engulfed me with curiosity as I read it all the way home. I was so captivated by that article that I went inside and opened it on my computer. And it was at that moment that I saw my cousin, Maxine Crump, who was standing in that sugarcane field. I went on to see pictures of that cemetery that you saw, that grave site. That's where my father is buried, and many of other family members are. From that point forward, I did not know what to think of my own church and the faith that I have known for my entire life. My family had been devoutly Catholic, and many members, including me, remain so today. In the days that followed, I had to ask God to guide me through this path. If ever I needed God's help so that I could live a purposeful life filled with peace, it was then and now. And so I began to pray fervently, week after week, for peace, consolation, understanding, wisdom, and guidance. Those prayers of forgiveness for those who enslaved our families. Those prayers of peace so that I didn't live the rest of my life in anger and shame. Those prayers of understanding of how my ancestors kept their faith and passed it on to me and many other family members. Those are the prayers that sustain me today and allow me to come here and share this story with you. I come today in love. Love for my church and love for my fellow humans. And it was in the time that after Father Tim Kesicki, in his role as president of the Jesuit Conference for Canada and the United States, apologized for this grave sin, that the descendants of enslaved ancestors and the present successors of Jesuit enslavers came together through guided dialogue of racial healing led by some of the best practitioners in the world to form the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. Now in 2023, I stepped into the role of board chair and CEO of the foundation. One of the first actions I took was to allow myself to dive deeper into the meaning of this foundation. Summer 2023, I traveled back to the site where Jesuits brought Catholicism to America. You saw one of those plantations, St. Inigo's. That's my family. I went back to Chapel Point, Maryland, and it was on those former plantation lands that I really heard the voices of my ancestors of long ago. I saw the channels where our family sailed and the banks on which many of their graves had literally washed back into those troubled waters. The meaning of being sold down the river took on a new life for me. Now, this work has been exhilarating. As a business professional with a long career in leading technology projects, I was ready for the complexity of this work. As an entrepreneur, I was eager to help grow an organization through its startup mode. As a business leader, I was excited for the challenge of managing the many people and groups who have a stake in this important work. And as a descendant, I felt called to deliver on a vision that guides the foundation, a vision that creates a world in which the false ideology of a hierarchy of human value is rooted in pigmentation supremacy, that it no longer exists. For the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, 2023 was a year of progress and milestones. An idea that began with an earth-shattering discovery in 2016 has grown today into an instrument of change and progress in the lives of individual descendants and a force for peace in the world at large. With the support of J.P. Morgan Chase, we have spent the last year building out our infrastructure, our processes, creating global alliances, and launching our first programs. Now, I bring forward the enterprise of J.P. Morgan Chase not because they are a benevolent contributor to our work. They also share in this history. Not only was it cruel to reduce human beings to chattel slavery and chattel property, it was also challenging to learn that our families were used as collateral for those wealthy purchasers in the transaction. So the descendants are now collaborating with J.P. Morgan Chase in our Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. Still, even as our focus tightens on our goals, we have broadened our lens and our message to make clear that our organization is for all descendants of Jesuit slaveholding, not only those who hail from the 1838 event. For we also know that the 1838 sale was not the first, and nor was it the last sale of human lives by the Catholic Church. We've accomplished remarkable things since this organization's inception in 2020. Our near-term plans will lead to an even greater impact, not just in the United States, but globally as well. Not only have we awarded more than $152,000 in descendant scholarships in partnership with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, we've also opened our office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana this year. And we also took on to launch in the next few months a home modification program for descendants. And we find the needs are great in our descendant communities. But we also know that we've taken on a path to reconciliation that has not been walked before. So there is no well-trodden path for us to guide us. But we also know that our destination and the commitment that lies within our hearts acts as our compass. We receive validation of this model of reconciliation from other organizations outside the Jesuit community. And we're honored to be with you today to share more about the great work that we're doing and to invite you to join us in truth and racial healing to transform the world. Thank you.
I'm the third presenter, and I'm going to need a little technical help. So my name is Father Tim Kesicki, a Jesuit priest. And you've heard two very powerful presentations. I can say without a doubt that my life has been changed by Rachel's work and my understanding of my Jesuit vocation. And I almost can't have words for my relationship with Monique and other descendants. But I'd like to begin by saying that my focus is, what do you do now that you have this information? If you're like me, a successor of an enslaver, or your family was, or you know that somehow your institution or your city or your business is, what do you do with that information? And there are others here whose families perhaps descend from enslavement. How do you respond? I don't have the answer, but I would like to share how I responded. And you know, one of the questions many Jesuits ask are, where were you when Rachel Swarns' article came out on April 16th, 2016? Now, I'll admit that I did know the history, but not from Jesuits. In 1991, I was studying at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies, Xavier University, New Orleans, and Father Cyprian Davis, a African-American scholar, wrote The History of Black Catholicism. His book had just come out, and it's chapter 2, A Catholic Church in Chains. And it was in that chapter that I read the history of Jesuit enslavement. Fortunately, I read it alongside African-American Catholics who gave an understanding or a perspective. And like so many of us in universities, I took that book and put it on a shelf and waited for the next course. It wasn't until April 16th, 2016, that all changed for me. And on that day, I was attending a meeting of the Jesuit Conference of Africa in Madagascar in Antananarivo, Madagascar. So I was on the other side of the world. And when Rachel says that article was read by 1 billion people, it was read across the oceans that day. We were in a session. And now that we have devices, what do we do when we're in sessions? Someone is presenting, and the rest of us, well, the system's about to shut down. Somebody was presenting, and the rest of us were on our devices. You know how we pretend we're following along. Well, the article came up, and I can assure you, everyone read it. By the end of that session, every one of those African provincials came up to me and said, "Did you see this?" I said, "Of course I saw it." And their question, what are we going to do about it? I approached the stories through the lens of 2016, and some of you may remember that about 9 months earlier in September was the first time Pope Francis came to the United States, the first pope to actually address Congress. And in that address to Congress, he had a line which says we can't judge the past by the standards of today. And yet, I'd like to go back to the past because I think we can judge the past by the standards of the past to frame our response in the present. This is 2016. This is what Georgetown looks like. You go back to 1836. It looked a little differently. It looked like this. And yet, how were those buildings built? And how was that university sustained? And I really want to walk through one letter tonight before we get into the general conversation. And it's a letter. I'd like to focus on a map and 2 photos. One photo you've already seen. The map, these are the Maryland Jesuit stations, but each of these coincides with a plantation. And it was from these plantations that human life was sold. You've already seen this face, Father Thomas Mulady, who was the former president of Georgetown and Maryland Provincial, who had to write a letter to this man, John Philippe Rotin, in Rome, the superior general of the Society of Jesus. I have to say something very brutal but true. When I think of Monique's family, Isaac Hawkins, Nace, and Bibby Butler, they didn't have human rights, but they counted as property. And in order to sell them, the provincial needed permission from Rome. So Father Mulady writes a letter to Father Rotin asking for permission to execute the sale. And the first responses were very negative. And then Rotin writes a letter which I believe has changed very much the course of history. This is an image of the letter, handwritten in Latin, 1836. And I want to focus on one very clear passage in the letter. Here in Latin, Father Rotin writes, ut conscientie debito gravissimo satisfiat, which translates, in order to satisfy the gravest debt of conscience. Why are those words so important in this letter? In order to satisfy the gravest debt of conscience. Because in 1836, the head of the Jesuit order in Rome knew that he was walking on moral quicksand. He knew there's something wrong about this, that I'm giving approval to the sale of human life. Now, traumatically and sinfully, he did grant conditional approval. But for anyone who says that we're judging the past by the standards of the present, I can assure you, they knew in 1836 this was wrong. He goes out to lay some conditions. One of them he writes in Venditone stipulandum commodum exercende religionis, which would translate, it must be stipulated in the selling that the free exercise of religion be given. And throughout the letter, because we baptized and catechized human beings whom we later sold, the general says, keep the families together, keep the faith strong. And then he adds something else very significant. He says, et assistentia sacerdotis, translating, and the assistance of a priest. So while he is walking on moral quicksand and approving the sale, he's telling the Jesuits in very clear and certain terms, continue the faith and send priests. No priest boarded the Catherine Jackson, the ship you saw. No priest accompanied the 272. And you will soon see that none of the conditions for the sale were met. I said, how do we respond? My response comes directly from this letter. Can I be the priest who walks with Monique and Sherilyn Branch and Joseph Stewart and Earl Williams and Jeremy Alexander and Melissa Kemp and the many descendants whom we've seen this day? Can I be that priest who assists? Sometimes we can go back to the past to find the answer for the future. But this letter also has a direct link to the vision Monique Maddox just shared about the Descendants Foundation. Because Rotin wrote other conditions in this letter. Rotin wrote, it will also be in keeping with charity and justice to provide carefully for those, and the Latin is nigris, which translates Negroes, a term we wouldn't use today, but I want to be true to the text, who on account of burdensome age or incurable illnesses cannot be sold and transferred elsewhere. And then he goes on to write, the money which will be raised from this sale absolutely must not be spent on making expenditures nor on paying off debts, but it is capital which ought to be invested so that it might grow. And if you look at these to provide carefully for those who cannot be sold and transferred, and that the sale should be used as capital which ought to be invested so that it may grow. When Descendants encountered this history, the vision from the foundation came from this letter. Your general put conditions on you for this traumatic and sinful sale of human life. Could not what he set out be the benchmark from which healing, truth, and reconciliation begin? And I'll never forget in those convenings which Monique referred to, a descendant, Sherilyn Branch, said to us, "You sold our descendants once. We do not want to sell them again. We're not looking to put money in our pockets, rather for you to partner with us on investing in the descendant community, not just this generation, but generations to come. We owe this to our ancestors, and you owe this to your faith." I end with a final image. And this is, on the right, descendants who met at that liturgy of apology, contrition, and hope on the campus of Georgetown University in 2017. You can actually see in the front row Mrs. Monique Maddox, our president and foundation chair. But there's still a rupture between the Society of Jesus and the descendant community, between the Catholic Church and those whom we held enslaved. While we have begun an effort at truth, racial healing, and reconciliation, there's so much more that has to be done. I thank you for your attention. I believe we can now move into a conversation where we can see how we can grow from this experience. Thank you.
Please take a seat here if you wouldn't mind. And pull screens up. I'd like to have you, and those mics have to be turned on, by the way, so hit your switch up. I would like to move into a conversation. So please think about anything you'd like to ask or comment on. We'll do, I'm not going to rush it. This is a longer session than we usually do at the Hank Center. We're going to 8:45 because it's part of a symposium. So we're going to kind of speak as you think about how you want to contribute. And I'm going to ask each of our speakers a pointed question and then get a response. And I think I'll work back in the order from Father Kesicki, then to Monique, and then to Rachel. And the first question for you, Father Tim, is, first of all, that was some first-class PowerPoint work there.
But a casualty of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you got, but you know, it really helps, doesn't it, to kind of learn. It can really, and Rachel, you get the photos. It helps. You know, you're drawn into it. So I want to thank you for that. Georgetown University is blue and gray, and it's a conscious choice. They're trying to reconcile, because if you go to the campus, there's a cemetery, and there's Confederate soldiers and there's Union soldiers who are buried there. And so they make a conscious choice for reconciliation in that moment. However, they neglect a larger reconciliation that you address head on. And as you have, Father Tim, for many years as president of the conference. So let's ask you, you know, we talked earlier about a language battle. If you talk about a reconciliation fund, you might get money, you might not. If you talked about reparations, you're going to get another reaction. But what's been some of your struggles working from within the Jesuit context, Catholic context, and what are some points of light that you've seen so far in growth?
Well, a first point of struggle, and I'm so grateful for the April 2016 headline, but we noticed that, and maybe it was your editors always favored the Georgetown name.
Were you guys happy about that?
Please?
I said, were you happy about that?
Some were. Some
Yes.
were. The problem with favoring the Georgetown name, Georgetown has probably a bigger name globally than Jesuit. And the byline has it was the Jesuit priests who sold. The separate incorporation of this university, of Georgetown, of all these institutions, is a mid-20th century reality. That in the 19th century, those decisions were made by the Jesuit order through the structures, the governance structures, the superior general in Rome, the provincial, the local superiors. It wasn't really until 1960 that Georgetown had non-Jesuit board members. But even before then, they wouldn't allow board members who didn't come from the Maryland province. So, I mean, it was a very tightly held system. So that Jesuit mission is much broader than Georgetown University. You go to a cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, and you'll see a gravestone to 6 persons enslaved who came from plantations in southern Maryland to help establish that mission, which Rachel thankfully alluded to Arnold Damon having come from a novitiate that was founded by that mission. So the roots of this are Jesuit and are much broader than Georgetown University. There's a book out by an historian at Xavier University, C. Walker Goller, which talks about the Jesuit universities that were built and founded on slave holding. So one of the challenges is that people say, well, this is a Georgetown issue. No. Georgetown's a primary beneficiary, and the moral response is needed, but it's much bigger than a Georgetown issue. I think that is a first challenge that we face. The second, in any number, way, shape, or form, is that this happened so long ago. And it's true, no one here has subjective responsibility, but we believe there's an objective reality passed on in generations that begs for restorative justice.
Very well said, and thank you. Again, keep thinking about your questions. Over to you, Monique. Maybe we stay on that. You mentioned J.P. Morgan Chase. You do your banking with Chase. You have to look at the genealogy of the corporation. I do believe it's Citizens Bank. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Citizen State Bank of Louisiana.
And what were they doing back in the day?
Well, they bought our families. I mean, they held our families as collateral, and J.P. Morgan then acquired those assets, which is our family members.
So that's one thing to think about, and the largeness of the web here of history. Does that mean you face the history, you run away from it? I think we have to go into it.
We absolutely do. So Descendants then, once we learned that history, orchestrated a meeting with Jamie Dimon, the head of Go Straight to the Top, and let's talk about what you're going to do with this history now that you know it. And it was a 30-minute meeting. Much of it was waiting for Jamie to come in the room, but it did happen. We had the meeting, and they said, what if we do not? What if we do nothing? What's the cost of not doing something? That is really their response is, we have to do something, but what is that cost? And so they assigned a team to work with us, the Virtual Services Corps from J.P. Morgan Chase, and we were going through our upstart of a foundation in the very beginning, and they helped us form what that organization would look like. So, you have a CEO or an executive director, you have an administrative assistant, what are all the people you need, and this is how much money you need. And they sort of laid all of that out pro bono. They were paying these volunteers to do that work. And so we came through all of that, and then we said, okay, now give us some money to help support our organization getting started. And so they have given us a grant for capacity building. So they've initiated with a capacity building grant. It was a 2-year grant for $2.5 million to get started, for us to get our operations up and running. So that is their first response. We have gone back and said, at least Jesuits have gone back. I haven't, but Jesuits have gone back and said, we want you to put forth a meaningful contribution, not just $2.5 million.
I didn't raise Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan Chase to divert from the complicity and culpability of the Catholic Church at all, and the Jesuits, which brings me to you, Rachel. So, the book itself, majestic and important, but an article from 2023, last year, in the New York Times, that you say you remain Catholic. So in the face of all of this injustice, atrocity, injury, pain, sin, you remain. Can you say a word about that? I'm sure people ask you all the time about that. Why do you remain?
It's an interesting question, and actually for a long time I avoided those kinds of questions. Because, you know, I actually, after the first story ran, one of my colleagues said, oh, wow, what an interesting story. You'll write something about being black and Catholic and et cetera. I was like, no, you know, this isn't really about me at all. You know, and actually I'm kind of old school in that way, because it truly, that's not kind of the work that I do. But obviously, you know, I am Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic. You know, I have, you know, ties to, you know, Catholic New York. My mother arrived as an immigrant with her family from the Bahamas in the 1950s, a struggling family, and when struggling Catholic family. And when they made their way to New York, my grandfather went to see the bishop at the time, and he said, well, there's a place in Staten Island. And it was run by Dorothy Day, you know, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, who is now on a path to sainthood. And she had this farm in Staten Island where my family lived. And just recently, I was mentioning to you, it's only recently that I realized that she wrote about my mother and her sister. She wrote about my grandfather's funeral in the Catholic Worker. I had the Catholic Worker on my kitchen table as a little girl. I had no idea why we were getting this. Excuse me.
She's the godmother of one of your, isn't she the godmother
And
of
she's the
one of
godmother, yeah, of one of my my mother's siblings, yeah. So, you know, people often kind of want to shake me by the shoulders and say, "Why are you staying?" And I often want to say, "Where would I go?" Because again, it's, you know, I happen to be Catholic. I happen to be writing about the Catholic Church, but this is American history. I mean, so many, you know, where would I bank? You know, where would I mean, this is our history. So, so that's part of it. And also, you know, faith is a mysterious thing, right? You know, and in a weird way, even though this is such painful history, you know, as I said, I grew up in a northern Catholic church. It was an Irish and Italian American church. You know, I can see myself in this church in a way that I couldn't before.
Okay, we're going to open it up here. So please raise your hand.
I feel like my professor self here. Don't be shy, people.
Rachel, just a question about the writing project. Were there other families you could have chosen that you had access to enough material? Or I guess, are there other books that you would like to write?
Oh, probably many. Yeah, no, it's true. You know, I spent so much time interviewing families, and I was like, oh gosh, I'm going to settle on one. Like, how am I going to explain this? You know, really, it just came down to the records. Honestly, that's what it came down to. There are many, many books. There are many, many amazing stories. You know, I wanted a family that I could carry through the space of time, you know, from as far back as I could go to the present. And if you're writing about enslaved people, that's really, really hard, you know. We're talking about, you know, 1634 when the Jesuits arrive, right, in Maryland. And so what really helped and sealed the deal for me for this particular family was the lawsuits, to be honest with you. So they filed, as I mentioned, lawsuits against the Jesuits, fighting for their freedom in the courts. Those records exist. There are depositions from Anne Joyce's descendants, from white people who knew her. I mean, so it gave me a whole century from, you know, to use. And because her family, she told that story, and you can see it, you know, she arrives in the 1600s. these lawsuits are filed in the 1790s. They're still talking about what happened to her. Louisa continues to, it allowed me to tell the story, and really that's the reason why I ended up with that family.
So it was mentioned that there are almost two railroads, one railroad or one path of reconciliation and another railroad of denial, essentially, of saying this is in the past, what does this have to do with us? And so I'm curious for each of you in doing this work, what's a question or a practice or a tool that you've used to help people inch closer towards that road of reconciliation as opposed to staying in that road of denial or of ignoring the importance of this?
I can go first. It's someone who's journeyed down this path. As I mentioned, I am a practicing Catholic. I've done every volunteer opportunity in the church there is. From baptism up to trustee of the parish. I mean, I've done it all. And so for me, I also was a member of the adoration team. So going to weekly holy hours was a way for me to really discern greatly with God what the path should be. And God spoke to me and said, you need to go and meet people where they are. It's hurtful, and you go and you listen to them. And then you figure out how you can walk together on that path. And so for me, it was about, how do I know where you are on your journey? Let's talk about it. Let's have communion together. Let's be in community so that we could learn how to walk this journey together. There is no greater vision than a path to reconciliation. And by that I mean, I walked through, I don't know where I am, Madonna Destrada, is it this side? Yeah. I walked through there before I came over today because I wanted to feel that space. I wanted to get the sense. I wanted to look at all of those stations of the cross. Jesus was persecuted, but he still made his way. We can do this. This is hard work, but if we really, truly believe in Christ and the reconciliation that Christ offers, there's no other way. You have to listen to one another, be in proximity with one another, and walk that path together as brothers and sisters.
The only word I would say is the word you said, proximity. And I find that the greatest resistance is from people who are in a closed circle. I can't tell you how many people have barely read the headlines of these articles and talk about them. And I always say, where is that in the article? They never read it. They read what somebody on social media said about it. And they formed a conclusion that's not even remotely close to what anyone here is doing. So I would just say proximity, proximity.
No, they said it well. That's fine.
I was interested and would like to learn more your thoughts on the disconnect between what we heard about with the Jesuit concern with the indigenous people and the enslavement or the issue there and with black people and the difference and why.
I will try. So, it's interesting, at the time, there was a, the indigenous were enslaved too, right? There was a prominent Catholic priest who, really vehemently championed the indigenous. Originally, the argument was that, we should substitute, these beastly Africans who are stronger and better suited for it. And he wasn't alone. There were others who also championed the indigenous, and they were successful. I think we know, the church is a spiritual church, but this was, a profitable enterprise. The slave trade was. And there were many Catholic countries that were interested and deeply invested in the trafficking of Black people. I say that as something that is simply true, and I don't know the internal of I haven't seen the letters that said, well, this would really be a not good financial decision for us to make. I wouldn't say that, but that's the kind of thing I wonder about.
I'll add a little accent. That's something I studied when I was younger, and if I remember this right, but there's the doctrine of discovery,
Right.
1450, and then 1494 as well. And it outlines licitness of enslaving indigenous to further Christendom, basically. But rescinded by Paul III in 1533. And there's a long story, right, back and forth, right, Rachel?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there was a time where, Rome said, well, you can conquer these places in Africa, but if the people are Christian, are Catholic, then you can't. But that didn't last long.
I appreciate you going back a little more in history, because I think that would have been my big question is, how did it get to the point where the Jesuits were even involved? And they weren't alone.
They weren't alone, and it's really
they are-
also important to know that in Latin America, the numbers are far
Right.
greater.
Yeah, and there were religious orders of women.
Oh, yes.
So, but I just want to note that I think the priest you're referring to is Bartolo de las Casas.
That's right.
And my understanding is that he changed his
He
mind.
did. He
And I
regretted.
think it's good to look at that change and see, well, what brought about that change?
Yes.
And then he argued against slavery.
Enslavement of Africa. He did.
For the same reasons.
Yes, that's right. He did. He could see what happened as a result, and he did change. But unfortunately, it didn't. Yep, and it didn't change things. Yep.
Hi. So I guess I'm going back and building on the question concerning kind of the intersectionality of the experience of slavery by Africans and African Americans, but also the genocide, right, of 63 million indigenous folks, right? And we think about some of the original sin of this country and how both of those are kind of things that are very difficult for folks to talk about. I'm curious if you can reflect on just like how intersectional, like the advocacy and the scholarship that you all have been part of, like how do you view that as intersectional with kind of the striving for justice within the indigenous community? And in what ways, I guess, like as Catholics, right, do we find, I think, strength to kind of see these issues as kind of inextricable from one another, as painful as that can be?
I think about the boarding schools. How can we not think about that, right? And a lot of these priests who came initially, the mission was, for the indigenous. That's why they were many of them originally, the Jesuits came initially. And a lot of people talk about that. There's obviously more scholarship now, I think, and there are historians in the room who would know this better than I would. But obviously that's a real parallel.
There are parallels. I think it was last Saturday, I don't know where I am most days, but I was attending, and it wasn't speaking this time, I was attending a session on truth and racial healing for the indigenous community. The parallels are very striking. What I would say is that I talked with some of those researchers in the Catholic Church who are studying more of the indigenous communities and what their history looks like, it was really brought to light by the Department of Interior, and that is what's forced a lot of that research to happen on the indigenous communities and their enslavement by the church, or their boarding schools. Well, they don't even call it enslavement. They're boarding schools, separating kids. It was human trafficking, separating kids from their parents and sending them to schools and not seeing them again. Many of these stories were told in that session, but it was almost forced to be done in order to be told. And that's why I feel like you hear a lot more today about the native boarding schools, because the Department of Interior came forward and said, okay, you need to open up your records. And so those records were open. So I talked with some of those historians about what are they researching about African Americans. And then I got, well, you know, there were 2 separate books. You know, there was 2 books of baptism. So some of those books are missing. So we may not have some of those records. So you just, the parallels I see between native boarding schools, African Americans being enslaved, and let's just add the sex abuse scandal, they're all toxic. They're all things that people want to run away from, but 2 of them have more actions than the third. So the sex abuse scandal is, let's talk about litigation. That's where the litigation is. And you see dollars coming out of the wazoo for that. Department of Interior forced the church to come forward on Native peoples. There's no talk other than what you hear in these individual pockets about what's happening and what has happened to African American enslavement by the Catholic Church.
No, I think this is true, I will say, you know, you're going to hear from an archbishop from Rwanda tomorrow, and there is truth in racial healing in light of the 1994 genocide. I've been to South Africa. I don't say it's perfect, but there's been truth in racial healing, and Canada had a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in response. Again, it even led to a papal apology, perhaps not directly. But these are areas where you see some, in a sense, national effort. There is no such effort in the United States. And as a matter of fact, if you begin the conversation, you can almost anticipate within days a think tank coming up with a very sophisticated way of deconstructing what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well said. We have a couple more, so please think. But Rachel, real, not quick, but you were the bureau chief in Johannesburg. How did racial dynamics civically, politically, culturally feel compared to here?
Well, I mean, I was there 4 years after apartheid ended, so it was very, very present. I mean, this history was not even history. I mean, it was, everyone around you had lived through this history, and it was, it was very raw,
So this question's kind of for Father Tim. So I applaud the Hank Center for doing this. I'm grateful to Mike and everyone for doing this. We're great at conversations. First step in the sacrament of reconciliation is confession, right? And then contrition. But part of the essential elements is penance. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that material reparation must be made for wrongs. And when material reparation is not possible, some other form of substitutionary atonement, right? So given, sorry that this is a little bit of a technical thing, but given the fact that these Jesuit universities are separately incorporated, the current Midwest Provincial, the Maryland Provincial could come, do a great workshop, encourage, but can't necessarily bring to bear the society's full hierarchical weight on these Jesuit entities to make material reparation. So how can how can, someone from the Jesuit hierarchical level kind of force the Fordhams and the Georgetowns and the Loyolas not only to host workshops, not only to hire individuals that are, thinking about this stuff, but, all right, so I have Jack the Bulldog on my back. I moved some of those guys out of Milady Hall into the new Jesuit residence. I've got skin in the game. You guys did a good job. I'm ruined for life. My question is, a lot of my peers went on to work at JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all that other stuff. There's a lot more we could be doing in terms of involving alumni in the work. We are also, in a sense, beneficiaries of this, of the society's decisions. And so, I guess, how do you push the institutions to do this work and not just host workshops and have committees?
That's a very good question, and thank you. So let me begin by saying, you've heard it said there's no legal settlement here. There's not a legal response. Our response is a moral response. Creating a charitable foundation, all the things that we're doing is a moral response. I think the first thing is that every institution needs to know its truth. Georgetown University began to respond when they knew their truth, and I think the Jesuit order is coming to a deeper understanding of our truth. All of these institutions have to know what their roots are, where they come from. That simply has to happen, and in light of that, how are they going to respond? We work with, we have a lot of work we're doing with universities studying slavery. It started out at the University of Virginia. And we get to a lot of brick walls with this group because they want to memorialize the past. Of course, they don't know who exactly in many cases. They want to memorialize the past. They want to set up a center for the study of enslavement. They want to partner with HBCUs. They want to do all of these things, but there's no talk about investment in the descendant community. And until that wall is breached and we talk about those of us who benefited investing back, I don't think anything's going to really change or be transformed. So, when I was president of the conference, I didn't have jurisdiction over the provincials, but in our congregations, I was called a moral authority. So I tried to use that moral authority. I mean, it's true, a provincial's jurisdiction over this university, I'm on the board of this university, by the way, the provincial's jurisdiction over a university is ultimately the sponsorship, the name Jesuit. But there's a lot relationally, not just with the board and the president, but with the Jesuit community and the institution. How do we encourage that ownership to say, we recognize we're connected to this history. We believe that if we want to combat racism, this is a morally just way forward. And then there's always the question of where is it in the hierarchy of priority at the institution? Is this central to our understanding of our truth, as I think Georgetown had to face in 2017, or is it just a smorgasbord of things that we have to take into consideration?
And you found that at Georgetown, if you notice, the students really push that to the forefront.
It's interesting in both instances, right? Because the students, Georgetown established its working group before the student protests, but it was the student protests that drew Richard Cellini's attention, and also the Reconciliation Fund that I mentioned that Georgetown has established. That came together after students themselves said, Georgetown, you're taking too long to figure out what to do. And they voted to tax themselves, essentially, to impose a fee that they wanted to pay as a student body to contribute to some fund that would support Descendants. So students have played an important role in kind of pushing things along at Georgetown.
Dr. Harris.
Oh, I'm sorry. Leslie, how are you?
I'll be speaking tomorrow, so I was hesitant about asking this question, but I couldn't. I'm Leslie Harris, and anyway, I won't say all that. You'll hear tomorrow if you come back. I'm curious about this. I love this part of the conversation in particular, because you're correct that universities studying slavery have struggled. We've all struggled, those of us who started these kinds of projects. My own project at Emory came out of trying to actually address racial issues at the university now by understanding the history. So getting people into conversations about the history, not so, oh, now we know, but now we literally at the end of our community dialogues, now that you know, how will you walk differently? As simple as having a cup of coffee with someone you've never talked about this with, as complicated as doing a your own department-wide whatever project. But in the over 20 years since we started that work, it's become more and more clear to me that the only way to really get leverage on these issues is both something that's intrinsic to higher education, but also much bigger than higher education. So one thing is that we all started in our little individual institutions, as we've already talked about. And there are few, that even with universities studying slavery, there's been a real lack of understanding of how to leverage those, 90, maybe over 100 institutions together. That's one thing. When I think, though, about the Jesuits and or the universities, yes, collecting funds is great, but it can't stop just with a narrowly defined group of descendants, and it can't just stop with slavery. Because slavery led to all kinds, as the Ta-Nehisi Coates, for most people, is what really outlined the way that it led to redlining. It led to things that we're still dealing with. And you know, it's sticky to say it in the United States, but what happened, but there are many things that the Catholic Church steps in on politically. There are many ways that, that higher education steps in politically. That what I hoped would happen when I saw this happening with Georgetown was that the moral authority that you claim and disperse would lead to a much broader reckoning. And it has to if we really want these histories to do something more. You're correct. Most universities are like, okay, here's a name change here, here's a statue there, here's a couple of fellowships. That's nowhere near the debt that, and it is exemplary. The example needs to be, it is not just about higher education. It is about everything we touch in this institution, in this nation, not to mention in the Americas, not to mention in Europe. And we just are reluctant to get over that hump. Institutionally, we barely, I'm sorry, but setting up a scholarship fund, that's like 1960s. And so I just put that out there to try to have us think collectively. We are at a moment when higher education is under attack at every single level. People are saying we don't need it anymore. Where are our voices as academic institutions about that as well? That is all part of the resistance to what we're all trying to do here. And so there is a need for a kind of political, I won't say political, a mobilization around these issues, linking them to the threats to higher education. And the money is important, but just as important is really convincing people that this is critical to everyone's future. And it's that gets to be missing when we say the descendants or the descendant community. We are all descendants. We're descendants of founding fathers. We are descendants of enslavers and enslaved and of Native, however you want to put that. And that making that connection for this nation, we have a Supreme Court filled with, what do they call themselves? Originalists? Original slavery. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harris. I would invite, if you want to respond to Dr. Harris, and thank you, Dr. Harris. We'll see here, Dr. Harris tomorrow on the first panel. Just closing remarks, just from our three. Just closing insights, and then we'll wrap the evening.
I'll start. So thank you for that. When we began our foundation, we started with 3 pillars. I'll continue that. Because we started with a vision for $100 million. We know $100 million at a 5% annual distribution does not take you far. Let's be real. That's $5 million. It does not take you far. We started with educational scholarships. We started with, which was also a part of the written letter. We also started with the elderly and infirm, which was a part of that letter. Those things were intentional to get the Jesuits to agree, because it was in that letter. But that's not the end. The other piece that we're looking at is truth, racial healing, and transformation. That's where half of our dollars go. Now, yes, descendants are upset about, why are you giving all this money out to truth, racial healing, transformation? Because that's where the groundwork is. You have to do that work in order to uplift everyone, to go to the redlining, to bring the think tanks together, to bring researchers together, to do the hard work around mitigating systemic racism in this country. And so that's why we began with the pillars that we began, but those are just the beginning. And as we get more dollars, we'll continue to build this out.
I just want to thank everyone for their attention. I often say what we're doing, it's very small. It's almost a micro solution to a macro problem. It is important to me, though, that we commit to something as imperfect as it is. Often when I speak on this, I was the one who gave the apology at Georgetown, and I will read 3 published critiques of the apology. I have to say the kind published critique is here. One from the front page of the Wall Street Journal and one from an historian at the University of Nebraska. And I always say when I present, I go, now which of them is true? They're all true. All the critiques are true. Because even an apology is going to bring a lot of conflicting voices. That doesn't mean the apology was wrong, and it doesn't mean we don't do it. We can't be afraid of criticism. We have to continue to make steps and move forward, as imperfect as it is, or we're going to be having the same conversation 10 years from now.
I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I do feel like, the bishops in, I think it was, 2018, put out a pastoral letter against racism. And, one of the things they talked about was just the importance of listening and being able to hear. And we're in a time when that seems very hard for a lot of people. But I think we do need to understand this history to move forward. And I'm just so glad that you guys all came. We appreciate it. We all have to start somewhere, and there's a lot of work to do. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.